The night was cold, and the darkness under the bridge felt heavier than usual. The distant hum of cars passing on the highway above barely reached the silence below. Then, cutting through the stillness, came a faint, high-pitched sound, soft but insistent, like a cry for help. Officer Ryan Carter, a veteran of many night patrols, slowed his cruiser and cocked his head. "Did you hear that?" he asked his partner, Mike Sanders, a rookie still adjusting to the unpredictable nature of their shifts. "Yeah," Mike replied, leaning forward to listen. "Sounds like a dog." Ryan nodded, pulling the car to the side of the road. Both men grabbed their flashlights and made their way cautiously down the muddy embankment beneath the bridge. The sound grew clearer with every step, pulling them forward until their flashlight beams landed on a heartbreaking scene. A German shepherd lay in the mud, her body trembling and her wide brown eyes reflecting the light of their flashlights. Nestled close to her side were 3 tiny puppies, barely old enough to open their eyes. The mother dog, clearly exhausted, seemed to be using the last of her strength to shield them from the cold. Ryan crouched slowly, taking in her fragile state. His flashlight glinted off a worn collar around her neck, and engraved on a small metal tag was a single name, Zoe. "Hey, Zoe," Ryan said softly, his voice gentle and steady. "It's okay, girl. We're here to help." Zoe didn't move, but her eyes stayed locked on his, full of both fear and hope. Mike scanned the area with his flashlight, frowning as he noticed subtle details. A few snapped branches, some scattered debris, and faint impressions in the mud. "Ryan, look at this," he said. "These tracks. Someone was here. She didn't get here on her own." Ryan stood and followed the beam of Mike's light, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the scene. Zoe's trembling body told a story of resilience, but the marks in the mud suggested something more troubling. Someone had been near recently, and the thought weighed on both men. "She stayed here, protecting her pups," Ryan said quietly, looking back at Zoe and her tiny litter. "She must have been waiting for someone." The moment was broken by an unexpected sound, a faint scuffling of movement above the bridge. Both officers froze, their ears straining to hear more. Zoe's head lifted slightly, and a low growl rumbled from her throat, warning them that something or someone was nearby. Ryan exchanged a tense glance with Mike before turning his attention back to Zoe. "We'll get her and the pups out of here," he said, his voice calm but determined. Still, deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. The air felt colder beneath the bridge as Ryan and Mike stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Zoe's low growl had stopped, but her body was tense, her ears perked and alert. Ryan crouched next to her, shining his flashlight toward her face. Her eyes were locked on his, full of exhaustion but also trust, as if she knew he was there to help. "We've got you, girl," Ryan whispered, trying to calm her. But something about the stillness in the air made his stomach churn. Mike moved a few feet away, his flashlight scanning the surrounding area. The ground was damp, covered in broken twigs and patches of mud. That's when he noticed something unusual. Faint footprints leading to the spot where Zoe and her pups lay. "Hey, Ryan," Mike called softly, pointing at the tracks. "Someone was here recently. They didn't just leave her here by accident." His gaze shifted back to Zoe, and his voice softened. "Why would anyone do this to her?" Ryan stood, his face grim. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered, scanning the bridge's shadowy beams above. "But right now, we need to focus on getting them out of here. Zoe's pups won't last much longer in this cold." He reached for his radio to call animal control, but before he could speak, a noise from above froze him in place. It was faint at first, a crunch of gravel, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Both officers snapped their heads up, their flashlights pointed toward the source. "Who's there?" Ryan called, his voice firm and steady. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, out of the corner of Mike's eye, a shadow darted between the beams of the bridge. "I saw something," Mike said, his voice tight. He moved his flashlight toward the movement, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Ryan's jaw clenched as he turned to Mike. Stay here with Zoe and the pups, he said firmly. I'll check it out. Mike hesitated but nodded, glancing nervously at the shadows above. Ryan climbed the embankment quickly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the top, the air felt sharper, and a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered. He swept his flashlight across the area, every muscle in his body tense. Near the far edge of the bridge, something caught his eye, a crumpled piece of paper pinned beneath a rock. Kneeling, Ryan picked it up and unfolded it carefully. The writing was smudged, but one word stood out, clear and unsettling. Run. A chill ran down his spine as he stood, his flashlight darting toward the surrounding shadows. Below, Zoe barked sharply, startling Mike. Her gaze was locked on the darkness beyond the bridge, her body tense as if sensing danger. Ryan hurried back down the embankment, clutching the note tightly. We need to move now, he said, his voice low but urgent. Whatever had happened here wasn't over. The sound of footsteps returned, this time louder, coming from both sides of the bridge. They weren't alone. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly in the night, sending a wave of tension through the air. Ryan tightened his grip on the note as he scanned the darkness, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Mike stood by Zoe and the pups, his breathing shallow as he glanced around nervously. Ryan, Mike said, barely above a whisper, what did the note say? Ryan hesitated for a moment, his jaw tightening. It said, run. Mike's eyes widened. Run? What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his voice rising slightly. Zoe barked softly, her body still tense as her gaze remained locked on the shadows ahead. Ryan shook his head, his instincts kicking in. It's not a coincidence we're here, Mike, he said, his voice firm but quiet. Someone wanted us to find her, and someone else doesn't want us here. Stay sharp. Ryan stepped closer to Mike, keeping his flashlight sweeping the area. We need to move them now. Zoe and her pups can't stay here, he said. Mike nodded, bending down to Zoe's level. It's okay, girl. We're going to take you somewhere safe, he murmured, trying to calm her. Zoe's eyes flicked between the two officers, and though her body remained protective of her pups, it was clear she trusted them. As Mike prepared to lift one of the pups carefully, a loud noise erupted from the darkness above. A clang, like metal striking concrete. Both officers snapped their flashlights upward, their hearts racing. The beam of Ryan's light caught movement, a figure darting between the beams of the bridge. It was quick, almost too quick to see clearly, but it was enough to confirm their worst fear. Someone was watching them. Get the pups in the car, Ryan barked, his voice sharp. Now, Mike didn't argue. He reached for the first pup, cradling it gently, and placed it inside the blanket he had grabbed from the patrol car earlier. Zoe let out a soft whimper but didn't stop him. She seemed to understand they were trying to help. As Mike worked to secure the other pups, Ryan kept his flashlight trained on the bridge above, his other hand instinctively resting near his holster. The footsteps started again, slower this time, as if whoever was up there was pacing deliberately. The sound echoed eerily in the quiet night. Ryan took a step forward, his voice steady but loud. Whoever's up there, this is the police. Show yourself. His words hung in the air, met only by silence. Then, from the shadows, came a chilling reply. A deep, quiet laugh, followed by the sound of footsteps retreating into the night. The laughter echoed faintly in the air, chilling Ryan and Mike to the core. For a moment, everything was silent again, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Ryan's eyes stayed fixed on the dark beams of the bridge, his flashlight sweeping back and forth. Whoever had been watching them was now gone, or at least they wanted the officers to think so. Mike, how are we doing with the pups? Ryan asked, keeping his voice steady but his body tense. They're in the car, Mike replied, his voice shaking slightly. He glanced down at Zoe, who had risen to her feet for the first time. Despite her evident exhaustion, she seemed to sense the urgency in the air. Her pups were safe, but she wasn't ready to leave just yet. Zoe's gaze stayed fixed on the bridge above, her ears twitching at every sound. I think she knows something we don't, Mike muttered, looking at Ryan. Ryan nodded. "Animals always do," he said quietly. He crouched down next to Zoe, running a hand gently along her side. "Come on, Zoe. It's time to go," he said softly. But Zoe didn't move. She let out a soft, low whine, her body trembling slightly. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something more. It was almost as if she didn't want to leave this place. Ryan furrowed his brow, glancing back at the bridge. What was it about this spot that had Zoe so on edge? Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness. A loud thud, coming from the direction of the tree line near the bridge. Ryan stood quickly, his flashlight snapping toward the source of the sound. "Stay with Zoe," he ordered Mike, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ryan took a few cautious steps toward the trees, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he approached, the sound of movement became clearer. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was definitely there. "This is the police," Ryan called out, his voice firm. "Come out where I can see you." But there was no response, just the faint sound of footsteps retreating further into the woods. Ryan hesitated, weighing his options. Should he pursue whoever it was or stay with Mike and Zoe? He glanced back over his shoulder, seeing Mike kneeling next to Zoe, his flashlight scanning nervously. Ryan took one last step toward the trees, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right. Then, from deeper in the woods, he saw it. Another crumpled piece of paper pinned to a tree trunk with a small metal tack. He pulled it free, his breath catching as he read the words scrawled hastily across the paper. "Turn back." Ryan stared at the note in his hand, its words stark against the dim beam of his flashlight. "Turn back." His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the darkness around him, the weight of the warning settling heavily on his mind. The woods were silent again, unnervingly so, as if holding their breath. Behind him, Mike called out, his voice carrying a nervous edge. "Ryan, what is it? Are you okay?" "Stay with Zoe," Ryan called back, his voice steadier than he felt. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, his instincts urging him to return to the others. Whoever had left these notes was trying to send a message, but was it a warning or a threat? As he took a step back toward the bridge, another sound broke the silence. A soft rustling, deeper in the woods. Ryan froze, his flashlight aimed at the trees, but the beam revealed nothing except dense shadows and swaying branches. Back under the bridge, Mike was doing his best to keep calm. Zoe stood protectively in front of him, her body tense and her ears perked. Her pups were safe in the car, but Zoe's refusal to move from the spot only heightened Mike's anxiety. He glanced up toward the trees where Ryan had disappeared. "Hurry up, man," he muttered to himself. Ryan finally emerged from the tree line, his expression grim. Mike immediately noticed the tension in his partner's face. "What did you find?" he asked, standing up as Ryan approached. Ryan pulled the note from his pocket and handed it to Mike without a word. As Mike read the hastily scrawled words, his eyes widened. "Turn back? What does that mean? Are we in danger?" Ryan exhaled, glancing back toward the woods. "I don't know," he admitted, "but someone's been following us since we got here. They're leaving these notes for a reason." He looked down at Zoe, who hadn't taken her eyes off the woods. "And she knows it too. We can't ignore this." Just as Ryan finished speaking, a loud, metallic crash echoed from somewhere in the distance, making both men jump. The sound came from the far side of the bridge, and it reverberated through the cold night air. Zoe barked sharply, her body now fully alert. Ryan and Mike exchanged a quick glance before Ryan spoke, his tone urgent. "We need to get Zoe and the pups out of here. Now!" But as they began to move toward the car, a shadow appeared on the far side of the bridge, lingering just out of reach of their flashlights. The shadow lingered at the far end of the bridge, unmoving, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Ryan and Mike froze, their hearts pounding as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. "Do you see that?" Mike whispered, gripping his flashlight tightly. Zoe let out a sharp bark, standing protectively in front of them, her body tense and ready. The figure didn't move, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. Ryan raised his voice, firm and commanding. "This is the police. Show yourself." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the shadow took a step forward, revealing itself under the dim light. It was a man, dressed in dark, ragged clothing, his face partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap. His posture was hunched, and his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He stopped just inside the beam of Ryan's flashlight, his head tilting slightly as if studying them. "I didn't think anyone would come," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Ryan and Mike exchanged a cautious glance. "What do you mean by that?" Ryan asked, his tone calm but firm. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes darted toward Zoe, who was still growling softly. "She's been here for days," he muttered, almost to himself, "waiting, protecting them, like she knew someone would find her eventually." His words carried a strange weight, as if he knew more about Zoe's situation than he was letting on. Mike took a step forward, his flashlight aimed at the man's face. "Did you leave her here?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. The man shook his head quickly, his movements jittery. No, I didn't, I swear. He paused, his eyes shifting nervously to the woods behind him. "I just knew she was here. I've been watching, trying to keep others away." Ryan narrowed his eyes. "Others? What do you mean, others?" he pressed, stepping closer to the man. The man hesitated, his hands fidgeting inside his jacket pockets. "People come here," he said quietly, his voice almost trembling. "People who shouldn't. They do things." His words hung heavy in the cold air, and Ryan felt a knot form in his stomach. The man looked back toward the woods again, his body stiffening. "You shouldn't stay here. None of us should." Before Ryan or Mike could ask anything else, the man suddenly turned and bolted toward the treeline. "Hey, stop!" Ryan shouted, chasing after him. But the man disappeared into the darkness of the woods, his footsteps fading quickly. Ryan stopped at the edge of the trees, scanning the shadows with his flashlight, but it was no use. The man was gone. As he walked back to Mike, Zoe was pacing anxiously, her eyes darting between the woods and the bridge. "We're leaving," Ryan said firmly, his voice carrying an urgency that Mike didn't question. "But whatever's going on here, it's not over." Ryan's boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way back to the bridge, his flashlight flickering slightly. Zoe was pacing in tight circles near Mike, her body tense, her growls low but steady. The pups, now nestled safely in the car, were quiet, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. Mike glanced at Ryan, his face pale under the harsh beam of the flashlight. "What the hell was that, Ryan?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Who was that guy? And what did he mean by people who shouldn't be here?" Ryan exhaled deeply, his mind racing as he processed everything that had happened. "I don't know," he admitted, glancing back toward the treeline where the man had vanished. "But he was scared of something. And whatever it is, we're not sticking around to find out." He crouched next to Zoe, running a hand along her back to try to calm her. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "It's time to go." Zoe paused her pacing and looked up at him, her eyes full of worry. But after a moment, she finally let Ryan guide her toward the car. As they approached the patrol car, another noise echoed in the distance. A faint, metallic clanging sound, like something being dragged across the concrete bridge. Both officers froze, their flashlights darting toward the sound, but they saw nothing. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, gripping his flashlight so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Ryan scanned the area, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, but we're not waiting around to find out." Ryan opened the car door and helped Zoe climb into the back seat with her pups. She curled around them protectively, her body still trembling but clearly relieved to be with her babies. Mike slid into the passenger seat while Ryan climbed behind the wheel, the engine roaring to life. As the patrol car pulled onto the road, the tension in the air seemed to follow them, like an invisible weight pressing against their chests. The road was dark and empty, the headlights cutting through the night as Ryan kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "That guy," Mike said suddenly, breaking the silence. He said Zoe had been here for days, waiting, protecting them. Do you think she was waiting for us? Ryan didn't answer immediately, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I don't know, he said finally, his voice low, but dogs like her, they have a way of knowing things. Maybe she knew someone would come, or maybe she didn't have a choice but to stay. As they drove further from the bridge, Zoe let out a soft whine from the back seat, her head resting on her paws. Ryan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, a deep sense of unease settling in his chest. Whatever had happened under that bridge wasn't just about an abandoned dog and her pups. There was something darker lurking in the shadows of that place, something that man was too afraid to explain. Ryan's gaze returned to the road, his jaw tightening with determination. We'll get you somewhere safe, Zoe, he muttered under his breath. But I'm not letting this go. Not until we figure out what's really going on. The patrol car sped through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine breaking the silence of the night. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Mike sat in the passenger seat, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his seatbelt, his mind replaying everything they had witnessed under the bridge. Zoe, curled up in the back seat with her pups, occasionally lifted her head to glance out the window, her eyes still alert despite her exhaustion. Ryan kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts churning. The man's cryptic warning and sudden disappearance left too many unanswered questions, and the note, "Turn back," echoed in his mind like a siren. Mike finally broke the silence. "Ryan, we need to report this," he said, his voice tinged with frustration and unease. That guy wasn't just some random drifter. He knew something about Zoe, about the bridge, about whatever the hell is going on out there. He turned to look at Ryan, who remained focused on driving. You saw the look on his face. He was scared. And now I'm starting to feel like we should be too. Ryan exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. We'll report it, he said. But we need more than just gut feelings and a guy who bolted into the woods. Right now, Zoe and her pups are the priority. Let's get them safe first. Then we'll figure out the rest. His tone was firm, but Mike could hear the underlying tension. Ryan was rattled too, he just wasn't letting it show. As they approached the local animal shelter, the streetlights illuminated the small, unassuming building. Ryan pulled into the parking lot and cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Zoe let out a soft whine from the back seat, breaking the silence. Ryan turned to look at her, his gaze softening. We're here, girl, he said quietly. This is just a temporary stop. You're safe now. The shelter was still open, its warm lights spilling out into the night. Inside, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Margaret greeted them. Late night rescue? She asked, her voice gentle but curious as she noticed Zoe and the pups. Something like that, Ryan replied, his tone clipped. He explained briefly about finding Zoe and her pups, leaving out the stranger and the notes for now. Margaret listened intently, her eyes narrowing with concern. You did the right thing bringing them here, she said, kneeling down to check on Zoe. But from the looks of it, this mama's been through a lot. We'll take care of her. As Margaret led Zoe and her pups to a quiet corner of the shelter, Ryan and Mike stood by the door, their minds still on the bridge. So, what now? Mike asked, crossing his arms. Ryan glanced at him, his jaw tight. We go back, he said simply. Mike's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you serious? After everything Ryan cut him off. That man didn't just stumble across Zoe. He was scared of something real, and we need to figure out what it is. His voice was calm, but his eyes were resolute. We're not letting this go. The drive back to the bridge was shrouded in an uneasy silence. The faint glow of dawn crept along the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty streets. Ryan and Mike barely spoke, each lost in his own thoughts. For Mike, the idea of returning to that place, after everything they had seen and heard, made his stomach churn. For Ryan, however, there was no question about it. Something wasn't adding up, and leaving without answers wasn't an option. As the patrol car rolled to a stop near the bridge, the scene felt eerily different. In the dim light of morning, the area seemed almost ordinary, stripped of the oppressive darkness that had made it so unsettling the night before. But Ryan's instincts told him the danger hadn't disappeared. It was just hiding. Mike glanced nervously at the bridge and muttered, "This feels like a bad idea." Ryan shot him a look. "I know, but we need to figure out what's going on here." They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot breaking the stillness. Ryan adjusted his flashlight, despite the growing daylight, and led the way toward the embankment. The place where Zoe and her pups had been lying the night before was now empty. The flattened grass and muddy paw prints the only evidence they had ever been there. Mike crouched down, running his fingers over the disturbed ground. "It's like she was never here," he said quietly, almost to himself. Ryan ignored the comment and scanned the area. His eyes landed on the same treeline where the mysterious man had disappeared hours earlier. "This way," he said, motioning for Mike to follow. The two officers made their way into the woods, the tall trees swallowing the faint light of morning and plunging them into a shadowy silence. Every step felt heavier, the crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs amplifying in the stillness. Deeper into the woods they found it, a small clearing with signs of recent activity. An extinguished fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by scattered trash and empty cans. Ryan picked up a crumpled piece of paper from the ground and unfolded it carefully. The writing was crude and jagged, but it was clear enough. "Stay away." Mike's face paled as he read it over Ryan's shoulder. "Okay, that's it," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "This isn't just some random camping spot. Someone's been here recently, and they don't want anyone finding out why." Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, the sound of a branch snapping underfoot. Both men froze, their hands instinctively moving to their holsters. Ryan raised his flashlight, the beam darting across the clearing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but edged with tension. For a moment there was no response. Then, from the shadows, came a low, deliberate voice. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice sent a shiver down Ryan and Mike's spines, low and steady, with an unnerving calmness. Ryan spun toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping the dense treeline. "Show yourself," he barked, his hand hovering over his holster. Mike, breathing heavily, tightened his grip on his own flashlight. The morning light barely pierced through the woods, and the shadows seemed to press in closer. Then a figure emerged, slowly and deliberately, from behind one of the trees. It was the same man from the night before, his face partially hidden by the brim of his worn baseball cap. "You didn't listen," the man said, his voice even but laced with frustration. He stepped closer, just enough for them to see his face clearly this time. His eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes, still dirty and tattered, hung loosely on his frame. "I told you to turn back," he continued, his gaze flicking between Ryan and Mike. "But you didn't, did you?" Ryan held his ground, his flashlight steady. "We're not leaving until we get answers," he said firmly. "Why was that dog under the bridge? What's really going on here?" The man let out a dry, humorless laugh and shook his head. "You think this is about a dog?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "You have no idea what's out here. You shouldn't have taken her. You've drawn attention to yourselves now." Mike, unable to hide the tremble in his voice, blurted out, "What does that mean? Whose attention?" The man's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "The kind of people you don't want to meet," he said grimly. "They use this place for things you wouldn't understand. That dog. She survived something she shouldn't have. And now so have you." Ryan took a step forward, his patience wearing thin. "Enough with the riddles," he said sharply. "If you know something, you need to tell us. Now." The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, almost reluctantly, he muttered, "They come here at night. They've been coming for years. They use this place to hide things, to do things. That dog? She saw too much. That's why they left her there. They were done with her." His voice broke slightly, and he looked down at the ground. "And now that you've taken her, they'll come looking for you." The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Mike took an instinctive step back, his mind racing. Ryan, however, kept his composure. If that's true, then you're going to help us stop them, he said, his voice resolute. The man let out another humorless laugh. You don't stop them, he said. You just survive them, if you're lucky. Before Ryan could respond, the man turned and bolted back into the trees. Ryan shouted after him, but he was gone as quickly as he had appeared. Ryan turned to Mike, who was visibly shaken. What do we do now? Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan looked back toward the clearing, then to the paper in his hand with the words, "Stay away," scrawled across it. We protect Zoe and her pups, he said firmly. And we figure out who's behind this before they figure out who we are. As the two officers walked back toward the car, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. Whatever darkness lingered under that bridge and in those woods wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting. But Ryan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.